Pretty much every weapon you can choose from in the Battlefield games have their very own iron sights to go with them, and although a lot of them can seem pretty obstructive and awkward to use, hence why a lot of people tend to flock to optical attachments and scopes whenever they're available, some of the iron sights you'll be able to find on certain guns actually do a really good job on their own, letting you lock onto targets quite accurately and gun down those targets fine enough without any fuss. Because there's a hell of a lot of weapons in the series to run through, and because everyone's got their own preferences and opinions on what's good and what's not, this list is obviously going to be a bit subjective. I've got to admit, putting this one together wasn't very easy, especially when it comes down to putting them in a particular order. And there's still a lot of good iron sights out there that didn't quite make the shortlist. But these are some of the ones that I tend to enjoy using the most, that I consider to be some of the cleanest, least obstructive, and easiest to use effectively. Here's my top 20 best iron sights in the Battlefield games. So kicking the list off with the F2000, one of the more popular assault rifles in the Battlefield games set in modern times. A lot of people tend to like using the F2000's very own unique 1.6x optical attachment, and they've got a pretty good reason to, with it being a really clear sight that's very easy to use. With that said, it can seem a little bit bulky at times, and so the standard iron sights can also be a nice alternative too, despite being something that often gets forgotten about and neglected. Compared to a lot of the other irons in Battlefields 3 and 4, the F2000s are surprisingly simple, basically being a ring with that foresight at the front. There isn't really anything that gets in the way very much, with the rear sight being pretty easy to look past in gunfights, and overall you can track enemies and stay on target quite easily. Next up we've got the Type 88, a light machine gun with some of the better LMG iron sights from the game set in present day. The Type 88's been around for quite a while, and its iron sights have been pretty decent across the board, from Bad Companies 1 and 2 to Battlefield 3 to Battlefield 4. Unlike a lot of the other LMGs in the Battlefield games, the Type 88 doesn't really block out too much screen space, having a sight picture that doesn't obstruct your view very much or create any kind of awkward problems. The iron sight itself is literally just a little thin ring with a simple post popping up in the middle. Very clear and very easy to distinguish. Although it's looked a teeny bit different across the games it's featured in, the Type 88's iron sights have always been consistently useful and effective, never really giving you a big reason to trade them in for some short-range optics instead. In 18th place is the RIBEYROLLES 1918, a pretty old weapon that you'll be able to find in Battlefields 1 and 5, that's often considered to be one of the first assault rifles ever to be made. This gun's sight picture is practically the same in both of the games it's featured in, having a thin pointy post at the front and a little bit of a trench-like rear sight that needs to be looked down in order to see it. There's not much else going on, and the gun itself barely takes up any space on the screen, so there isn't really much to draw your attention away from those iron sights, letting you simply line up that front notch with another player and gun them down. Because that front notch is so thin, this actually makes it more precise over further distances, which is kinda handy, with the RIBEYROLLES being able to perform quite well over longer ranges, due to it using an intermediate cartridge. Coming up next is the M45 from Battlefield Hardline, an SMG from Sweden that can only be used by law enforcement in the game. The M45 often gets a bit of a bad rep in Hardline, being one of those guns that a lot of people tend to dislike, mainly because of that crappy fire rate and lack of range, letting it down in gunfights. But although the weapon itself might not be all that favourable, you can't exactly blame its iron sights, which just so happen to be some of the clearest in the game. There's no denying that there are quite a lot of rubbish iron sights in Battlefield Hardline, but the M45s are generally less obstructive than most, with that middle post standing out like a sore thumb, being really easy to distinguish amongst the environment and everything else ahead. Perhaps not the most useful for longer ranges, with it being quite chunky, but still pretty good for shorter ranges, where the gun is designed to excel anyway. The HELLRIEGEL 1915 might just so happen to be one of the most hated weapons in the Battlefield universe. But one thing that isn't hated are those nice and clear looking set of iron sights, making the gun feel more accurate than it probably should be. Along with the fact that the weapon's got a bunch of nice, well-rounded stats, I guess you could consider this to be another reason why the gun feels so easy to use. Hence why there's so many people out there with about 100 service stars for the bloody thing. The HELLRIEGEL sights are very simplistic, with loads of space around that front notch, making it far easier to stay on target in full auto fire. Perfect for excelling within its optimal engagement range, while still giving you a very good view of everything ahead while you aim. The next iron sights in the list belong to the GEWEHR 43, a semi-automatic rifle from Battlefield 5 that can drop players quite effectively over pretty much all ranges. And the gun's decent power output over range is complemented quite nicely by the fact that its iron sights are extremely precise, in the sense that its foresight is essentially a needle, making it a lot easier to line up accurately against targets further away. The foresight also happens to have a bit of a hoop wrapping around it, which with some weapons can be a bit off-putting at times, but the GEWEHR 43 never really has this problem, because that hoop is also extremely skinny, which can easily be looked past to acquire your target ahead, kinda like the STG 44s. Apart from having that charging handle popping out from the left side of the gun in ADS, the GEWEHR 43's otherwise got a really satisfying sight picture, allowing it to be useful over further distances, without the need of a scope. As far as the CHAUCHAT's iron sights go, they're kinda similar to the RIBEYROLLE's, just a little bit beefier, with even more space around that front post, basically making it a wider trench to look through. This can often mean that you might find it easier to concentrate on that central aiming post a bit better, and it also means that there's probably less chance of those side parts getting in the way while you do so, overall giving you a decent level of vision, with the top of the aiming post being really pointy, and that base being a lot thicker and easier to distinguish quickly, drawing your eyes to that central point. The gun itself barely takes up any space at all on the bottom of the screen, due to it having a pretty narrow receiver, so you can put all of your attention onto those irons and focus on everything up in front, without having to worry about any obstructions that might block off sight lines and cause you any trouble while you play. Now, there aren't all that many bolt-action rifles in the modern day Battlefield titles that have very good iron sights. I suppose the bolt actions are designed with scopes and optics in mind, so most people are just going to go and equip some of those, generally suiting snipers, giving them a better view of other players in the distance. But the SV98 from Battlefields 3 and 4 does actually have a pretty decent set of irons, rivaling a lot of the other weapons in the games, with them being much clearer and simplistic. Small hoop, small front notch, and that's about it. Enough for you to line up your aim with another player without any trouble, and fling one of those bullets in their direction. A longer range scope might generally fit the SV98 a little bit better, but those iron sights can still do a decent job on their own, being clearer than a lot of the others. Speaking of clear looking iron sights on bolt action rifles, they don't get too much cleaner than the LEBEL 1886s from Battlefield 1, having that super skinny front post surrounded by loads of space. Just like a few of the other weapons in this list, the LEBEL sight picture is a bit like looking at a needle through a trench, only this trench is a lot more rounded in shape, essentially being a semicircle. Because that central post is so incredibly fine, this means that it's going to be even more precise to use over those longer distances, where the rifle's designed to perform at its best, complementing its stats and allowing you to stay on target, while giving you a great view of everything else on the screen. It does sometimes get a little bit lost in the environment if there's quite a lot of action going on, but just so long as you can stay focused on that front post while you aim, the LEBEL's iron sights are going to be able to provide you with tons of accuracy while you do so. Staying in Battlefield 1 for the time being with the semi-automatic CEI-RIGOTTI, the first rifle available in the medic class. This gun's got a somewhat similar sight picture to the LEBEL, only looking a lot more pronounced, with that front notch standing out a little bit more and being easier to see. It still comes to a pretty fine point at the top, but that trench looking rear sight that you'll be aiming down this time is more blocky. Not a bad thing, because it might seem a bit more reliable when you're aiming in to quickly take someone on, with that foresight popping out a bit more in the middle, being level with the top side of the rear sight. That rear sight might seem quite chunky, but it still gives you plenty of space to see the notch at the front of the gun in ADS, and for close to mid-range battles, the CEI-RIGOTTI's iron sights have got you covered, being very accurate and perceptible. Coming up next is this SJÖGREN inertial from Battlefield 5, which basically takes the concept of less being more. What have you got to aim with the SJÖGREN? Well, you've got that little notch sticking up at the front, and that's pretty much it. Nothing too fancy, just a straight up easy to use iron sight that doesn't have anything flailing around getting in the way, while still looking nice and visible for lining up shots properly onto your enemy ahead. The SJÖGREN sights were decent enough in Battlefield 1, but they were a lot more pronounced when the gun came back in Battlefield 5, surprisingly ending up with some of the cleanest sights in the game. The fact that the front post is really thick at the base, but pointy at the top, makes it a lot easier to be precise with beyond close range, which might sound a bit pointless with the weapon being an all shotgun, but they become far more useful when you're using slugs rather than buckshot, actually giving those sights more of a practical use. And number 9 is the MG15NA with its funky looking tripod sights. This is another light machine gun from Battlefield 1, but unlike most of the other LMGs in the series, the MG15 doesn't take up half the bloody screen when you aim, having one of the most simplistic sight pictures of the lot. Those iron sights are the main focus as they protrude upwards from the bottom of the screen, and there's practically nothing else to get in the way. But despite not being very much to look at in ADS, the irons are still really distinguished, with the rear sight looking like a big pillar, making the whole thing look like a 3-pronged fork, which might sound a bit weird to aim with, but is surprisingly effective in practice. Once again, that middle post is really thin and easy to aim with, but the side posts are thicker, drawing your eyes to the centre of the screen. And overall, the MG15's iron sights feel great to use, being pretty simple, but still very functional. In 8th place is the SG-553 carbine from quite a few of the modern day Battlefield games. Another gun without any complicated iron sights that can do the job reliably in most situations. All you've got to look at is another simple hoop, along with another centre post sticking up in the middle. There's nothing else to really cause you any problems or get in the way, and in a way they're a little bit like the Type 88 sights, only with less stuff filling up the screen at the bottom, giving you a slightly clearer sight picture. The gun sights have been consistently clear in pretty much all of the games it's featured in, from Battlefield 3, Battlefield 4 to Battlefield Hardline. And although that centre post might seem a little bit too thick for gunning down players accurately over longer distances, they can seem a lot more effective within shorter sight lines and over medium ranges, where the SG-553 is designed to perform at its best anyway, suiting its role in the game quite well. Unsurprisingly, the RSC rifles also made their way into the list, having iron sights that are a little bit similar to the LEBELs, only with a slightly better sight picture and more prominent centre post. The RSCs featured in both Battlefields 1 and 5, and its sights haven't changed very much at all between the two titles, being some of the most minimalistic in the series, though it did look a little bit more like the LEBELs in Battlefield 1, with them almost being the same. Either way though, that really thin foresight makes the RSC a hell of a lot easier to do well with over those mid to long distances, and it lets you lead and track moving targets without any parts of the rifle's frame sticking out or getting in the way as you do so, which is always a good thing. It's one of the best iron sights in both of the games, so it definitely deserves its spot here on the list. Another weapon that's featured in both Battlefields 1 and 5 is the SELBSTLADER 1906 semi-automatic rifle, with its super fine front post. When you're using the SELBSTLADER 1906's iron sights, you're practically aiming with a friggin' needle. Of course, this is great for precision, because it allows you to line up the tip of that needle with another player, giving the gun a much higher degree of accuracy than a lot of the other conventional iron sights that you'll generally find on other weapons. Perhaps not the most ideal for close quarter engagements, where that needle can often get lost in all the action going on around the screen, but still much better for taking on other people further away, even letting you challenge snipers in the distance without the need for a scope or any long range optics. Speaking of needles, our next weapon's got another really skinny centre post and nothing much else to get in the way of your view. Battlefield 5's FG-42 has a ridiculously clean set of iron sights, which really help out for its precision. You've essentially got another needle-like foresight, slap bang in the middle of two really fine rings that wrap around it. Now sometimes, hooped sights can be a little bit obtrusive, especially if there happens to be two hoops forming both the rear and foresights. But this definitely isn't the case of the FG-42, because both of those little rings are really thin, so they never really obstruct your view or cause any issues, letting you focus on that centre post while you aim and shoot. The overall sight picture is probably one of the best in the entire series, with barely any of the gun blocking off sight lines in ADS, practically just having the sights presented to you on a column in the middle of the screen, making it all look very clean and easy to use. Next up on the list is the MONDRAGON rifle from Battlefield 1, which has got some pretty similar looking iron sights to the CEI-RIGOTTI's, only with a few slight differences. In a sense, the MONDRAGON's sights seem a little bit more tidy, giving you more space around that centre post with two L-shaped looking edges forming the rear sight further up the barrel. Because these two edges don't slant diagonally like a lot of the other sights in the game, this opens them up even more, giving you loads of room to see whatever's in front of you nice and easily. The centre post itself is a little bit pointier than the CEI-RIGOTTI's, allowing it to be a bit more precise to use over longer distances. Plus it's also got a bit of a chunky square base, which generally does a better job of drawing your eyes to the centre of the screen, letting you snap to targets quite reliably, with the center post at the front of the gun. In third place is the PP2000, which has appeared in quite a lot of the modern day Battlefield games, but is mainly superior in Battlefield 4, where that ring sight at the back became a bit thinner and less obstructive. The PP2000 has another fairly straightforward sight to use, having a ring with a very fine front post sticking up in the middle of it. In a way, it sort of resembles Battlefield 1's GEWEHR automatic, only a little bit more zoomed in and easier to see during fast-paced combat, which is a really good thing, because it gives you a very nice focal point in the centre of the screen, without becoming too obstructive or hard to aim with. Compared to most of the other guns in Battlefield 4, the PP2000 outright beats them regarding the clarity of its sights, and with the gun being most effective within close to medium ranges, it makes the gun quite easy to use here, without you being forced to equip any optical attachments. So in second place is the LMG 0818 from Battlefield 1, an iron sight that gives you everything you need to be accurate and nothing more. The 0818 sights are really simple, but really effective, giving you an incredibly clear view of everything in front of you, making it a joy to aim with compared to most of the other weapons in the series. Just like quite a few of the other guns in the game, the 0818's rear sight basically looks like a trench with a post sticking up in the middle, but in this case, that trench is wide as hell, giving you a really open view of everything in front of you around that centre post without any kind of obstruction. The post itself isn't the thinnest or pointiest, but it's definitely very easy to spot, and because most enemies you'll be taking on with the gun will usually be within a close to medium range, this perfectly suits the weapon, and lets it do what it needs to do accurately, without having any awkward parts sticking out, blocking any sightlines. So probably my number one iron sights in the Battlefield games belong to the good old Ross Mark III rifle from Battlefields 1 and 5. There's no denying that this gun's got a freaking gorgeous set of iron sights, allowing the rifle to be pinpoint accurate and take down its victims over practically any range it wants to. There's loads of space around the sights themselves, meaning the gun's frame hardly ever really gets in the way, and you're basically aiming with a super simplistic hoop and notch. Both of them are really thin and clear to see. The Ross Mark III sights are practically the same in both of the games it's featured in, and they're extremely precise and fun to use, letting you see your targets clearly ahead over pretty much all distances. The chunky pillar holding up the foresight draws your eyes to the middle of the screen, letting you focus on that hoop in the centre when you scope in quickly. And overall, the Ross Mark III sights are just really bloody good, useful in practically any situation. So those are my top 20 best iron sights in the Battlefield games, but do let me know which ones you think are the best down below in the comments. And make sure you subscribe and check out my channel if you want to see more content on Battlefield and other games. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll be seeing you in that next episode.